All right. Well, hey everyone, I am back. This is Christopher Lind, and we are going to be talking about how we're going to keep you future focused as we look at and demystify probably one of the hottest topics for 2023, which is artificial intelligence. And this is going to be a fun one as we continue living life at the intersection of business, technology, and human experience. Today, I am talking with Kevin Surace, who is a futurist, Silicon Valley CEO and CTO. And in case you were wondering, is this guy really have the technical snuff to carry those titles? He does, because he's got 94 patents. And we are going to get into all things artificial intelligence. So Kevin, thank you so much for joining me.
Christopher, I'm so happy to be here. This is going to be fun.
Hey, well, I hope you've had your Red Bull, because this is going to be a high energy conversation.
Let's do it.
And it's not going to be boring. That's the other thing that I can promise people who watch and listen to this, is that this isn't going to be a boring, highly technical conversation, even though we are going to talk about the highly technical nature of where things are. So for those who may not be as familiar with you as I have, I've had the chance to get to know you through this, which has been an absolute pleasure, by the way.
Thanks.
Give folks a little bit of background into who you are, and how was this always a path that you were working on?
Well, that's a great question. Certainly, I could have gone to school at the time in the early 80s, which is when I graduated college. I could have certainly gone to school for AI at that point, and I would have learned Lisp, languages like Lisp, and done some basic AI work, and then it would have all died because AI literally went away and went into sort of nuclear winter in the mid to late 80s and early 90s, and there wasn't as much going on. And AI has had this cycle actually since the 40s or so, which we can talk about in a little bit, the history of AI. But what happened is I kind of landed in it. I was working for a company called General Magic, a very famous company in Silicon Valley, that had developed handheld devices pre-iPhone. They looked a little bit like iPhone. In fact, all the sketches looked like with the iPhone. And in fact, they were partially funded by Apple. So, and everybody there came from Apple. In fact, most of the team that wrote the original Mac OS was now on this project at General Magic. And they came out with the hardware. And the problem was the hardware was too big and too expensive. It was
before its time.
It was before its time. It needed another 10 years to get small enough to be an iPhone. So it was a big iPhone, but had a lot of the right characteristics, right? So since that was not working, I was brought in to come up with a new business model. And the new business model was, people do have phones. They were flip phones at the time, and they do work, but they're driving, and they do want their email. And they do want their stock quotes.
So they want a little bit more than just talking on the phone.
That's right. And they want their calendars. And they want. So we invented the virtual assistant. And at the time it was called Portico and MyTalk and Magic Talk and the Quest virtual assistant and the Excite virtual assistant and all of these things. We had millions of people on it. Well, to invent a virtual assistant, we needed a variety of AI tools. At the time, hidden Markov models for speech recognition and big linguistic models to know how to respond. Now, we didn't have a large language model at the time, and we didn't.
It wasn't large language models at that point, but it had to do some sort of recognition.
That's right.
Of somebody saying something and asking for something, and I need to do something in response to that.
That's exactly right. And we played some tricks. Some of the things we did is we would get you into a domain, and then we'd only have to recognize in that domain. So the minute you said something like, give me my email, read my email, I want my email, we would put you in the email domain, and then anything you were saying, like next or prior or whatever, we could assume had to do with your email.
It was like a choose your own adventure logic tree in some ways.
Yes. And once I had you in that domain, I knew there were only 1,000 things you could say, not 100 billion things you could say, right?
Yeah.
So that was very, very interesting. It's a very good trick. Well, all of that technology that we developed went on to be the basis of Siri, Alexa, and pretty much every other virtual assistant for the last 20 years. Got licensed to everybody. So that was the core technology. And a lot of what we did also was core technology around how can we make her, in this particular case, respond in reasonable ways. It was the first day that the product was out. We had hundreds, maybe thousands of users on it. And she could answer your phone for you even before it rang your phone. It was very cool. And then she could ring your phone, and then she could book an appointment. Like if Christopher is in my contact list. She could book me an appointment with Christopher already for me on my calendar.
Okay.
This is 1997, 98.
I was just going to ask in terms of time frame for
25
folks,
years
which again, this was right when the mobile thing was starting to really gain some steam.
That's right.
The
No smartphones
was
yet.
really starting to moan. Pretty soon, everybody had one. You were getting really complete. I mean, everyone had
we were
one in their
driving,
pocket.
and we wanted more access to our information, because at that time, before virtual assistant, all you could do is call your actual assistant and say, "Do I have something on my calendar?" Or look on a day timer, right? And did you write something down? So this was really huge, that all of a sudden you could get your email while you were driving. Like, unbelievable advancement. And she would read your email to you, by the way. She could receive faxes and OCR them and tell you what was in the fax. And you go, why would you do that? Well, people got faxes. In fact, they got orders. They got a lot of faxes in the mid-90s. Everything came on fax.
Came through fax. There was no, I mean, yes, there was email, but still, I mean, it was quite a long time. It's kind of fun doing the trip down memory lane with this, because it really was a different time in many regards. I mean, there were things where it was like, no, we only accept a fax. You cannot email.
That is true.
Actually lasted for a long time.
Long time. In some industries today, I just had something that we had to fax. It was something medical for my parents or whatever. And sure enough, it was an insurance company. They would only accept a fax. And we had to go to a fax service online that would fax it for us. Fortunately, they exist now. But it's like, this is ridiculous. We will only accept a fax with your signature. No other method. Okay, well, we'll find a way to do it. So the long and the short of it is, we developed a very human-like interaction. We worked with Reeves and Nass at Stanford, who had written a book called The Media Equation. And the Media Equation looked at how humans interact with computers, even when they're just computers. But if you said the computer was a female versus a male,
if you humanized it,
you would immediately anthropomorphize that interaction. So we used all of their theories and everything they had worked on students with, and we developed this very nice personality. Her name was Mary, and the woman who recorded her voice, her name was Mary, by chance, Mary Mack, who became quite a famous voice. Anyway, this technology went on to live with OnStar.
The voice of it was Miss Mary Mack.
Yes, it was.
I have a bunch of kids that is actually
literally
really
that's funny. The voice, Mary Mack.
Miss Mary Mack.
And she's still around. She's still doing voice.
Was she all dressed in black by chance?
No. But she was in the studio for months on end, right? We had to build a recording studio.
Oh, I have to imagine.
We had to build, because she ultimately had to say all these phrases that we had to concatenate together at the time, right? You couldn't just develop that. So, hi, it is, Wednesday, October 25th, whatever it is. And all those different inflections of 25th, 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 whatever. So anyway, all that was put together. And then we realized people within the first day were saying, oh, Mary, I love you. And she couldn't have the same response back. So we had to develop multiple random responses back. Oh, well, I care about you too, but I'm married, or whatever the case is, right? Oh, thank you so much. I don't think my boyfriend would approve. So you had all these different...
But back then you were manually having to think of all of these, like, what possibly might someone say to this that we don't have to have a recording of Miss Mary Mack saying something back.
Yes, and believe it or not, we... had the first ever, we hired a team of linguists that listened to everything that everyone ever said. It was anonymized, so they didn't know who it was, right? They were just listening so that they would all day code in new responses for Mary. That's how you had to do it. Big, huge rules engine, right? And with weightings and things. I mean, that's how you didn't have you had neural nets, but they weren't deep. You couldn't really do anything practical with a neural net for that.
No, it was nothing like. So it was much more manual in terms of stuff was
yes,
triggered.
But to the user, this thing was completely artificially
intelligent. Right, to the user, it was magic.
It was magic. It was magic. People went, wow. And so all of that, it went on to General Motors OnStar first, and that became the OnStar Virtual Advisor, and she was the voice of that, and then went on to become Siri and everything else, right? And Siri was built on all those patents. I think there's a lot.
So did you ever imagine when you went in to start working on this project that the work that you were doing was going to become the foundation of pretty much every AI assistant on the planet?
No. But what happened is, by partnering with Reeves and Nass, who had done fundamental research on how people will interact with human-like things, We just took it right from the book because they had done all this work with students. And so they had real research that says, listen, if you name her Mary, this is how people will expect the reaction, the interaction, and they will expect it to be human. And so you've got to make it as human-like as possible, as if she's sentient, right? So we know it's not sentient.
I warned you that when I have these conversations, I love just pausing people and diving in on this, because I am really curious with this, listening to some of the research and logic went behind this, because sometimes I hear things in response to, well, why are all our AI assistants female? Mm-hmm. And I'm really curious. It sounds like with this, there was a lot of research into how you came to the conclusion of, why are we choosing an AI to be female? Why is it Mary? Based on, well, we understand how people respond. Right. And if we humanize this thing and we make it this, they are more likely, like, we're trying to trigger the kinds of behaviors because this is unfamiliar territory to people. Yes. And we need to remove as many barriers as possible to make this a comfortable experience.
Yeah. It turns out that up till that time, people had only really interacted with other people. So the only way they knew how to interact was the way you and I would interact. They don't know any other way, right? You're not going to train them some new way. So you had to make the interaction
you could try, but then you're now creating a ton of resistance barriers. Right. I mean, I study human behavior, and I know all about the fact that, like, you try and create a new pathway for people. Right. You're pushing rocks uphill versus if you go, this is the way human behavior works. Exactly. Let's tap into that. It suddenly becomes adopted, and they don't even realize it.
And that's what their research said. And before they worked on this with us, they worked on Microsoft Clippy, which was a complete disaster. But Clippy was a little helper in Microsoft, and people just thought it was goofy and they didn't like it. It was too human, except it was a paperclip, and they didn't want to make it, it had no real voice. It had no human-like. So they made a paperclip human-like. That didn't work. People said a paperclip isn't human. But when you're talking on the phone and you hear what is a real recorded human voice, right? You're talking to Mary, and she would talk back. And there's some examples on the web of these very first interactions back in 1998 when we launched the product. And it's me on stage. It was my team. I led the research. I built the product. We built the operations center. There's no cloud at the time. You got to build your own.
It was all on-prem.
It was all on-prem. We built our own servers. We had a room of server assembly because we needed very specialized servers, very specialized boards. It was really magical, right? So that became the basis of everything. So no, I didn't know, but I did fundamentally understand that what we were doing would be fundamental to this field, right? Yeah. One of the other things we did, because we found out quickly that if you made devices, and we made some home phone examples called the Magic Phone, if you did that and you wanted to recognize what people were saying, you would not have the processing power in the device to recognize everything that they were saying. At the time.
At the time, you would not have had that kind of power.
So with our home phone technology, and it was wireless, and it could have been cellular, etc. What we would do is we would take it in and we would vectorize it. So we'd assign vectors to what we heard, send the vectors to the network. The network would do the analysis in under a second and come back and give us the proper response, and then we could respond. Okay. So that is how the iPhone has worked up until recently. So if you ever used Siri on the iPhone, since Siri was there, and it would say, "I'm sorry, I don't have a network connection, I can't respond," or something like that, it's because they would vectorize that voice, send it to the network.
Send it off to
the network would do the analysis and then come back. And so it couldn't even analyze what you were saying until very recently, because over the last 2 years, they've got enough power in the chips to do the voice recognition local as opposed to voice recognition in the network. So that was a core fundamental technology to allow Alexa and everyone else to actually work. Alexa does that in the network, couldn't do it in the device itself.
And that's crazy to think now. You think about, we talk a lot about, well, and I have a follow-up question for you, but we talk about how quickly things are moving, yet at the same time, things are also moving not nearly as quickly as it can seem sometimes, because even something as simple as that, the fact it's taken us over 20 years to get to a point where phone hardware was powerful enough to be able to process some of this stuff on the device itself. I mean, that's a pretty significant timeline.
25 years.
About it. 25 years to get to a point.
And we invented the virtual assistant, and 25 years later, it took 25 years of advancements to sort of get where we are. And for a decade in there were very few advancements. Actually, Siri is being rewritten now, so says the press, to use generative AI as a backing. But up till now, Siri still works with a basic rules engine. So its responses have been preset in rules, and there are lots of responses, but it doesn't just generate a response like Gen AI. It is literally based on the original patents and the work that we did in 25 years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So, well, and again, that for folks who end up watching and listening to that, I think this is one of those things that can seem like magic. There's a lot going on behind it, because that's an extremely complicated rules engine to have built on top of. When you think about the volume of things, it's
yeah, that's right. Apple had linguists that would listen. So our linguists had to do this. At first we just said, oh, people will say, give me my email. Except they say, get me my email. I want my email. Damn it, give me my email. They say all kinds of things, right?
They say all sorts of things.
And so you have to code those in and say they all mean give me my email, even if they said mail.
All of these different things mean this.
Literally, we could understand, I think it was 5 million phrases at the time. And a lot of those were just, 100 of them were ways to get your email. It was crazy, right? And so you had to code those all in at the time. You could not just take a guess that that's what they meant. So we'd code them all in, and that all led to something. So it was a huge rules engine. Well, that's truly exactly what Siri, Alexa, and others have done for a very long time. They had linguists listening, huge rules engine, keep adding more and more phrases and rules to the things you're saying. And that's what we built for a very long time. And now recently we have large language models that can understand language in a way that we don't need that rules engine. Now there's a different rules engine.
There's a different rules engine on the back end.
Oh, yes, there is.
Yeah.
That's probably just as big, which is do not say the following things. Do not answer the following questions. Don't talk about nuclear bombs. Don't tell them that you're sentient.
It's almost, and we'll get into how this has evolved, but in many ways, when I think about it, it's a similar thing we've created, but we've had to do the opposite, because before we were trying to say, what are all the things we need to create and do? And now it's creating, but oh my goodness, now we need to actually limit and filter this thing because we don't want it to go. The rules are actually restrictive versus generative.
That's right. It's exactly, before we had to be generative, and now we have to be restrictive. And actually, I would say the rules engine for, say, ChatGPT is probably much, much larger, best I can tell, than the rules engine we had to do to recognize. So in fact, all this work is still being done essentially by linguists. It's being done like in Turkey and stuff. And I think Google said they have 1,000 people on it for Bard. They've had 1,000 people on it for a year, literally writing thousands of rules a day. So you're looking at, this huge rules matrix, right? The guardrails, but everything that comes out of Gen AI then goes through this rules engine and says, am I going to accept that answer, or do I have to modify the answer in a way that is acceptable for humans? And they easily have millions of rules now. Well, it was actually easier to do what we did before, but nevertheless, it's pretty interesting, right?
Well, because in many ways, and we'll continue to talk about, but before, you knew what you were trying to get people to do. And I think, even for folks who may be in the learning space, we think about this a lot of times with, as you design an experience, you're trying to say, these are the different pathways we ideally want to keep you on. And yes, there might be different paths that you can travel through these things, but ultimately it's a pre-designed pathway, and we're just going to kind of, you went here, you diverged over here.
And we would play tricks. So if we didn't fully understand them, we'd say, Mary would say, would you like your email or your calendar? So I've just prompted them to say email, calendar, or neither.
You're creating the appearance of autonomy, but really there isn't, because we're really going, we're making it seem like you have choice, but really we've actually now just controlled you down to two choices.
Great. I'll get your email. What would you like, the next email or the prior email or whatever, right? So we would prompt them, and by prompting them, we'd get them basically to say, my next one or the prior one or erase it. Would you like me to delete that? Yes. It's a yes or no. So a lot of things we would do would prompt them in a way that forced them to basically say yes or no, right? Because those are easy to recognize. So it seemed very natural. We had to make
it
those
does.
interactions
And it
natural.
doesn't feel that way. And I think this is the part that's really fascinating about, and why I think it's so important to study human experience alongside of this, because at the end of the day, technology is almost rarely working in a vacuum by itself.
Right.
In many ways, it's like it's always working with people. So we have to understand people, and technological changes I've seen that don't take that human element into play, they just tank. They just completely tank, because it's like, well, you did not, which is funny you brought up Clippy.
Yeah.
Because
you remember Clippy.
Well, I absolutely do. And what's interesting about it is there's a whole industry now built on what Clippy really was initially trying to do, which was software adoption.
Right.
It was trying to improve adoption of software by helping people understand how to do things.
Right.
But to your point, it missed it in that people weren't wanting to go to this bizarre paperclip. And it was, again, in many ways, I think it was ahead of its time in that the power wasn't there to do what you needed it to do. And it crashed your computer. It blew up your OS. I mean, it was just a mess. But now there's a whole industry, digital adoption platforms, that are built on this digital layer that sits on top of your system and starts to predict, what are you trying to do? Can I help you with that?
Right.
Let me just take care of that for you. You're trying to fill out this form. Just give me this information and I'll go through and take care of it and automate that. So it's the next generation of it. But at the time, it seemed like, well, this is just stupid. But it didn't necessarily take into account, how do people really interact with systems?
Well,
they don't ask a little paperclip.
They don't ask the little paperclip. The very first interactions that were human-like were at MIT in the 60s, called ELIZA. And ELIZA was the very first, you couldn't talk to it, right? But you could type. And she used, for the time, very sophisticated sort of rules engine that would respond to almost anything you would say. So you could say, "Eliza, I love you," and it would have some responses that would come back. And they'd spent a lot of time sort of programming this. And when we did Portico, some people said, "Oh, it's Eliza, but now she's alive and I can hear her." Right? It had that same kind of feel, because what they were trying to do at MIT in the 60s, late 60s, was exactly that, give it that human interaction. So anyway, long story short, no, I didn't think I'd be the father of this technology, right? Of all of our, I just set out to solve a problem, which is, you're driving in the car, even if you had a screen, which you probably didn't at the time, you certainly couldn't look at it.
No.
Not everybody had an actual assistant, so I would give you a virtual one. That's all. I was just trying to solve a pain point. Pain point was, what's next on my calendar? Did I get any emails? Did I get a fax? Can you answer my phone and schedule people for me? That I needed to do those things, right? And what's the stock price? And it would do that. And that's what we made it do.
And so you were looking at, and in many ways, this goes back to what I was saying is kind of the goal of some of these conversations, is to help people be where the puck is going to be instead of where it is today. You were seeing what was happening with mobile phone technology and going, this is going mainstream. People are using it more here, but this is a pain point people have consistently with the phone. So if we could create something that would solve that pain point for them, it will. I mean, and probably, I'm guessing at the time, you had no idea quite how big that would be, but you went, this would be a significant solution to a major problem if you can get in front of it.
You know, everything I've tried to do for what it's worth is not create solutions for a problem that doesn't exist. Find the problem. Right. Wake up one morning and go, I know how to fix that problem. And how I got to this is, I was making a product before this called the Air Communicator, which was the very first smart cellular data phone. And this is the early 90s. This is 92, 93. We had a phone that could send and receive data, get things on its screen. It would receive faxes, by the way, store them in the phone, right? But some of that data, because screens were so expensive at the time, you would not be able to get till you plugged it into your laptop. And on your laptop, up comes a screen with a little app that said, an application that said, here's what's stored in your phone, and here's the things that you got. But Your laptops didn't have Wi-Fi at the time. There was no such thing as Wi-Fi. Okay, so you could plug this into your laptop and actually get on CompuServe, AOL, and BBSs. There was no internet per se in the early 90s.
Yeah.
And so you could literally get onto these services and get whatever email you had or check the news. And I'd be sitting in an airport with this hooked to a laptop. And I remember I was flying to Boston from San Francisco, and people came up and said, "What is that?" I said, "Well, that's the weather in Boston." How can you get the weather? How can you get anything on your laptop? Now, people forget this. The laptop was a disconnected thing. Whatever you had on it was all you could work on. It was a brick. Yep. And then I would plug in this device, and all of a sudden, with an antenna on it, and all of a sudden through the cellular network, we didn't have digital cellular. It was analog at the time. But through the cellular network, I could get data. It wasn't fast, but I could get data.
It was super slow. Okay.
So that was the very first cellular data phone. And so my learnings from
you had the first mobile hotspot.
I did. And it worked by itself too. When it wasn't connected, it would receive things, but then you connected it and it was there, right? So here's the thing. What I learned from that is great tool, but when you were with it in the car, it couldn't tell you what it received because it didn't have the power to do that. So if I could build a network service that could tell you what you received and maybe store it in the network, then it could work with every phone. I didn't need this device. I didn't need to wait to connect to my laptop. I could just work with it in the car from a Motorola flip phone. That changed everything, right? It changed everything, and everything going forward started to use this kind of technology to interact. And we called it a voice user interface at the time because we had graphical user interfaces.
Yeah.
We had GUIs and we had VUIs. And we really wrote the book on the VUI. And to this day, I mean, people use that book. It's sort of the Bible of how you write these things. So anyway, that, pain point, go solve pain points. And I've continued to go on and do that in many spaces, including the AI.
So was little Kevin, I'm just picturing little Kevin now, going back to little Kevin when you were a little kid. Like, were you just a problem solver at heart? I mean, how did you end up?
It's a great question.
Again, I think now when we think about it, going down a technical pathway is a very common thing. But I remember even for me in the early 2000s, even it was still kind of like, not many people were doing, is this thing really that big of a space? It was not as commonplace. So I go back a little bit further. What was little Kevin's dreams as a kid that then led to going, I think computers are the way forward?
Well, I really wanted to be an actor and a singer, so and a drummer, which I still get to do part of that because I do work as a music director and a producer for Broadway and create films.
Now that's a very unique mix, by the way.
Is.
That is a very unique right brain, left brain combination of personalities that is not, you don't find a lot of those plotting on the map. So initially you wanted to do acting and production.
And my dad smartly said, that's interesting. That's
interesting, but you need to make a living.
You need to make a living. You got to be an engineer. And if you want to do that on the side, fine. And I ended up being an artistic director and running a theater and doing all these things. So
it was really more of a pragmatic.
Pragmatic. Is like, go do that.
Really?
But he could tell that I was good at this. So I'll give you a few backgrounds.
Okay.
So when I was young, I'm building stuff with Tinker Toys, and I'm getting motors, and I'm building Ferris wheels and elevators and things that actually move with Tinker Toys, right? So I'm building entire carnivals out of Tinker Toys, not just sit there. They actually work. Like all of the rides move. This is before they had kits where you could do that.
Yeah, I know. Like my kids have like a Connects kit now.
Right.
It's all prefab.
We didn't have any of that. It was just Tinker Toys. You had little pieces of wood that you could put together, and you could get a motor and a rubber band and get things to turn and move. So I was always building things, and I think that's good development, right? I wasn't playing video games because we didn't have video games. So that's what I did. I did that and Legos and other things. And then eventually I did a lot of reading on electronics. And then over time, I began to repair radios and TVs in the neighborhood and around, and people would have me. I'm 14 years old. I'm ripping the back of the TV out and testing the tubes and figuring out what's wrong and fixing it and getting shocked by the anode once in a while. It's 14 kV or whatever it is. But that's what I did. And so I was learning about electronics. I had a early computer, a TRS-80, Radio Shack, and a TI-99, I think it was. And then I worked in consumer electronics retail, and I was the computer manager, of which we only had Atari 440s, 880s, and the Commodore 64 and 128. Those are the computers we had to sell. And I knew how to work them, and no one else in sales wanted anything to do with them.
Well, and I remember back in those times, there's definitely similarities to what you just described in terms of they sound very familiar to things. I took a different pathway, but again, kind of this, I was the kid, I drove my parents nuts because I would tear everything apart. And for me, it was more, well, why isn't it like this? This seems really dumb. Like if I could and I was not great at reconstructing it, but I was the one that would go, this doesn't make sense to me. If this was like this would make more sense. And my parents were like, can you just put the darn TV back together? Like, why did you rip it apart to go, I don't think this knob makes sense. If there was a device that I could control this from the ground, like why have they not built that in? That's how people want to interact. They're like, Christopher, just please stop tearing things apart.
Yeah.
But with that, it's really interesting hearing how your journey has kind of come together. And in many ways, it does make sense how that led to, I mean, again, practically speaking, why you did what you did, but it just happened to fit together with the technical side of things.
Happened to fit together. And look, I think problem solving is all it is. Curiosity and problem solving.
Yeah.
I think, and critical thinking, right? I think those things are very important. If this is the path you want to take, this is not a path for everybody. Not everyone wants to get up in the morning and go, hey, I've got an idea how to solve that problem. Because the problem is you don't have enough time in life to solve all the problems that you see, right?
Even
things that are designed wrong, things are...
Yeah. Even with what AI can do, it's one of those things where it's like there is more than enough problems in the world and we have more than enough work to do. And in some ways, I don't know if you experience this, but it can be frustrating when you see a better way or a different and going, why can't we just get to it faster? Like, why can't we close this gap?
Right. No question. And, I don't want to say left AI, but I did other things outside of AI, lots of them, including invention of soundproof drywall, which was 20 years ago and took the world by storm, and billions of dollars of that product has been installed in every new hotel, motel, every now,
how did you venture
all of that?
I know this is a little bit of a but maybe it's not, because again, going back to your point, I studied the skills and behaviors of people, and I can see actually a very tight connection to soundproof drywall, even though some might go AI to soundproof drywall. In many ways, you're using a lot of the same things, and it's a technological problem. If you really are thinking about it, it's an understanding of how sound. But how did you end up going, you know what I should do is invent soundproof drywall?
A friend of mine had a little company that was doing some coatings for vehicles to make vehicles vibrate less, therefore sound less, right? Make less sound, make less noise. It was for cars and boats and things like this. And what happened is I said, I'll help you out with that. And so I was helping him out with it sort of part-time. And calls would come in and they wanted to use it on their wall. I said, well, it won't work on your wall. It's a metal coating. It's a coating for metal to dampen metal, right? Dampen the sound of metal. Or damp the sound of metal. And people said, but I need to use it on my walls. Why? Well, I can hear the neighbors next door. I can hear people next door. I've got this hotel. We've been sued. And I go, well, the real problem isn't coating metal on vehicles, which they use this kind of coating on metal on vehicles today.
Yeah.
The real problem is walls. And the more I dug into it, people were getting sued left and right. They'd build condominiums. People could hear the neighbor. They would sue the builder because the condo is worthless if all you do is hear your neighbor at 3 a.m. I don't know what they're doing at 3 a.m., but you don't want to hear it. So it's really fascinating. And so the problem was coming to me, right? That's the problem. The problem is people are screaming that they could hear people screaming. Okay, well, we should go solve that problem. Well, it had not been solved in a good way. I won't get into all the ways that they used to solve it, but they're really painful and bad. And they end up not working long term. They can be shorted out just by hanging a picture on the wall or whatever. So I started thinking, it's true. I started thinking about how one can solve this. So the first thing you do is you go read all the patents in the field. You say, how have people solved? Sound is just changes.
And for folks who are thinking to themselves, I want to do what Kevin did. Just glean in on that part. of the way you saw. I went and read all the patents on how other people are soundproofing walls.
Yes.
And there you go. Some people might go, oh, no, thank you. No. And it's like, well, there you go.
I sat down for a few weeks. The patents were now available on the web, so I didn't have to go to a patent office, and I could read all of them and say, how did people solve this for walls? But also, how did people reduce vibrations in other things? Because if I can reduce the surface from vibrating, it will not carry the sound to the other side, thereby converting the energy, which was acoustic energy, essentially into work or heat energy, right? Very little heat, but nevertheless, what you're doing,
very
right?
Little. Right, you're just transferring it.
It turns out people, everything from disk drives to bridges, had used this concept of constrained layer damping. And constrained layer damping is where you have a viscoelastic polymer between two layers. And what happens is when air pressure hits a wall and it's not soundproof, it literally moves it like a drum head, right? Just literally moves it, right, which then moves it inside the wall, which moves it to the other side, and it basically goes right through very, quite efficiently. So you go, if I could make a piece of drywall that had constrained layer damping in it, then it would not want to move. And the easiest way to describe this, I'm going to move this for a second, is when you, what actually happens with two layers is they move like this. Okay. They're actually, now you wouldn't see that, but and if you've got something in between them that's elastic, it's viscoelastic, it's pulling it back. So as that curvature forms, it needs more space, right? And if I had a rubber band in there, it would be pulling against that. Does that make sense? In both directions. It'd be trying to snap it back.
It's almost you're snapping the curvature back to straight faster so that there's resistance to it.
There's
so
resistance to
moving forward.
That's right. That's called viscoelastic. It's a viscoelastic polymer that allows you to do constrained layer damping. Okay, so I had to invent a polymer that would be so soft for these frequencies and the softness of drywall as to be almost runny. That's as cured as it gets, right?
Okay.
So it's a plastic, but it's squishy. Like it never, it's squishy and it's elastic. And so then I read all of the variety of chemistries of how one does that with much thicker, much stiffer kinds of things, and said, all right, how can I learn how to make this softer? Basically, it's the easiest way to say it. And so I did. And so I got a big kitchen mixer, and those were the first, things. And I'm no chemist, but I learned enough about that chemistry. After this, I said, anyone can learn deep in one field in probably a few weeks, not broadly in the field, but you could learn one thing. And if you wanted to be the expert on constrained layer damp drywall, and you're inventing such a thing, you could probably be the expert in it a matter of weeks because nobody's ever done it before. So you can learn from all the other fields.
Right.
So that's what we did.
The more narrow the niche, the more specific the niche, the quicker you can dominate it.
And so that material has what's called a complex shear modulus that has to be calculated and then measured. Anyway, after we did all that, we sent all the drywall to labs and tested it, and it was blowing the numbers out of the water. It was, you're talking about 10, 15, 20 dB reduction more than regular drywall. Well, every 3 dB is half the volume. So, you're talking about reducing the volume by 70, 80, 90%, right? It's unbelievable. And this took the world by storm. And we had a whole bunch of patents on it and made it better over the years and eventually sold that technology to a company called Pabco that makes it today called Quiet Rock. In the meantime, now I'm in building materials, right? So two other things I did is I said, well, we're going to have software that manages the energy in buildings because we can do that much better than what there was.
Okay.
That became the Train Energy Manager, I think it's called. It was called Surace Energy Manager at the time. It became Train. Train's got it in thousands and thousands of buildings today. That uses AI, by the way, in predictive analysis. And we invented also high R-value windows, which I have in my home here. And I got to retrofit the Empire State Building, the New York Stock Exchange, about 70,000 other projects with windows that are 3 to 4 times more insulative than regular dual pane. And then I was hated by the window industry for a while because how dare you create such a thing? How dare you?
Well, because once you create something like that, then nobody wants to go back.
Well, that's the problem. The problem is,
in many regards, is like you go, well, why would I get any other thing other than that?
I'll give you a secret about the window industry. So the window industry decided about 25 years ago to specify windows with a U value instead of an R value. And I'll explain this in a second. So we understand walls might be R10, R12, R14, R16. We put R30 in our attics and things like that, right? R resistance to heat flow, higher numbers better, right? R30 is better than R10, better than R0 is an open hole, R0. R30 is super insulated. Makes sense, right?
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense.
So windows, including dual pane, nobody wanted to tell the world how bad they actually are. Although if you walk up to a dual pane window, you know they're cold in the winter and, etc. And they're hot in the summer. So what they did is they inverted it and said, we'll do it as U value. And so if you have... So
that we aren't using a familiar terminology that everybody's used to that could quickly go, hey, wait a minute, this is really inefficient.
Well, here's the thing. With U value, the closer to 0 you get, the more insulative it is, right? Okay, fine.
Oh, so you reversed it.
Inverted. It's inverted, right?
Yeah.
So an R2 window is U 0.5. Well, that's almost 0. It's amazing. Except it's only R2. Your walls are probably R14, R16. It's terrible. It's as close to an open hole, which is R0, as you can get, right? But by inverting it, then R1 is a U1, R2 is a U.5, R3 is a U.33, makes sense? R4, U.25. So that U value can only move between 0 and 1, basically, right? And 0 would be perfect, but it's inverted, so everybody thinks they're doing great. I got these new dual pane windows, and they're so insulative. They're a U.5. They're only R2, and your walls are R16. They actually suck. So then the window...
Interesting. So you kind of lifted up the rock and went, hey, by the way, this is ridiculous.
Let's just use R value because everyone knows what R value is. And let's just be honest. Dual pane windows are R2, dual pane with low E is R3, right? So we made windows that were R8, R9, R10, all the way out to like R16, right? And they had multiple chambers inside and different kinds of gases and suspended films and really cool stuff. Anyway, that's the long and short of it. Again, what's the pain point? Pain point for the Empire State Building is everyone's cold and no one wants to sit near the window in the winter, and they're too hot near the window in the summer, so we hate our windows. We went in and retrofitted the windows, took the old glass out, reused all the glass, built new windows on the 5th floor, put them in overnight. Now everyone wanted to buy the windows, and they got their money back in under 3 years for the whole building.
Wow. So, again, and it goes back to some of these innovations that they cost money, but in the end pay back what you spent on it very quickly.
Of course. Yeah, ROI is important in that industry. Anyway, we go on.
Okay. I know this was a little bit of a rabbit hole, but again, it helps paint a picture to one. I always love to get to know people and understand how their brains work. But to me, this is very similar because, again, these are technological innovations where you're deconstructing it and you're going, if we reconstruct this using different channels, different pathways, we can actually create a better tool. Mm-hmm. So with AI, though, transitioning back to that, we've talked a little bit about the pathway and the trajectory of what that's looked like and the fact this has been a evolution over some time. Now, as you look at it, since you've been involved in it for quite some time, where has it moved very quickly? And where have you seen it kind of stagnate, not taking out 2022, the past maybe 5-7 years where there's really been some major steps?
Well, I'm bringing up my little timeline of just language models here because I like to refer back to it. The very first language models for computers were called a bag of words and word embeddings. That was all the way back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s, right? Because we didn't have deep learning yet. And then we had something called a co-occurrence matrix in the 70s. And finally, we had some deep learning in the early 80s, including CNNs, RNNs, and LSTMs, right? And back propagation. So we already understood back propagation, CNNs and RNNs, and I won't get into what all of those mean today. But those are used today in large language models, which are really based on an RNN model in the end. And so
if somebody has no idea what that is, in layman's terms, what are we talking about?
Layman's terms. So
I think now the digital acumen of people, generally they understand the concept of deep learning, but
All right,
Maybe
real
not.
simple. Yeah, let's deconstruct it really, really simply. So what I want to build is a neural net. And for a long time, we could build just shallow neural nets, but they've been getting deeper and deeper. And finally, they could get very deep by 2012 when we solved some math that allowed us to go to now millions of layers if that's what we wanted to do. What is a deep learning neural net, basically? So what the computer does is it figures out by itself decision points, and then it weights a neuron, if you will, to get to the next decision point. So if this were me and I'm looking at Christopher, I can make decisions that it's Christopher. I can look at the hair on his head. I can look at his eyebrows. I can look at his eyes.
The lack of hair on my head. Yeah.
That's fair. That's a decision point, right? And in fact, I can describe those decision points. And what I'm actually doing even here is I'm weighting those. I'm going, his eyes are this blue. They're a little more blue than someone else I know, right? So that's a decision point. Maybe he has earbuds.
Going through this process.
So actually, our neurons do that, and they do it very, very quickly, right? So a neural net is based on the way we think humans may work. Now, I can describe a lot of my points in the middle, but for a computer neural net, we call them hidden layers, and they're hidden because there's basically
we don't know what it's doing. This is the black box in some ways.
I mean, we could go try to deconstruct it, but there's no English equivalent of what it's doing. That's the problem. Like I can put into language. I can describe your mustache in a language, right? I can describe that you do have a mustache. You probably combed it just before we went on the air. You know, it's kind of brown, doesn't have a lot of gray, right? I have descriptions of it, right?
You have words, you have language to describe what it is.
It does
thereby being able to explain how you use that to discern I'm talking to Christopher Lind.
Exactly. A neural net doesn't have the English language to use in that way, but it is still making those kinds of decisions. And it may make other decisions that we couldn't possibly understand anyway. You know, an earlobe that's a little different than another one or whatever it is, right? Really fascinating. So these are the hidden layers. So basically you have an input layer, a bunch of hidden layers, and an output layer. And all the thing does is add as many layers as it needs in order to differentiate Christopher from Kevin, from Jim, from Betty, from Bill, from Sue. Okay. And however many millions of people. So these can get very, very deep. And we got, really good at image recognition once we had really deep capability. If you'll notice, one of the things that's happened over the years is, people are going, wow, these algorithms are just amazing now. Well, they've kind of followed our compute capability. It's not that we couldn't have possibly done the math to do a deep neural net.
We just didn't have the computing power.
Well, it would have taken 10 years to run. So why would you bother?
Yeah.
It was not a useful model. But finally,
it wasn't practical. It wasn't practical.
By 2012,
to go through all that just to distinguish, is this a cat?
That's right. It was dumb.
Why would we waste that kind of time?
By the way, we had facial recognition. The FBI had facial recognition in the 60s, but it was using what they would use is they'd look at a face and the computer would say, what's the space between the eyes, and then the eyes to the nose would draw a triangle, and then the nose to the mouth, and it would do all of these kinds of vector kinds of things, right? And that's how in shape of the head and stuff like that. So it's not that we haven't had facial recognition. It was actually, it worked quite well. Now we can recognize based on billions of characteristics instead of 10 characteristics, right? Or 20 characteristics.
Yeah, it's again, going back to similar to kind of some of the things we're talking about, the trajectory of how things have changed was before you had a very predictable, these are the data points on a face that we're looking at, narrow it down to see how accurate. And it was, really, especially when you study the human head, it's a pretty predictable way to be able to do it. But now
really well for the FBI for 50 years.
Yeah, it worked very well for them. It's just now we have the computing power to assess and analyze so many more data points to come in.
That's right. And a lot of those are hidden layers. And so when it trains, it's building out those layers and those weightings on the neurons to go to each layer. And then later you reverse it and you say, now you're trained. I'm going to use you for inference, basically. And now I'm going to put a face in. So go recognize it. And it goes all the way through with all the weightings on each neuron for the eyes, the nose, the mustache, the whatever, things it can't describe. And it comes out the other side and says, oh, this is Christopher Lind. We know him. We've seen him before. And if I learned with supervised learning, then I had a name attached to it. If it was unsupervised, I know it's you, but I don't know your name, right? I can't solve for your name. But every time I see a picture of
unsupervised,
you,
it doesn't know the outcome. It doesn't have the outcome.
It doesn't have the. It wasn't trained with the outcome. It wasn't trained with the outcome of the formula. Yeah. So, but it still can pile you up with other Christopher Lins, all your picture, right? So when we train large language models today, they are unsupervised, and this is actually key. It's key because if it was supervised, it would know the difference between fiction and fact. It was trained unsupervised. It doesn't know when it reads a novel versus, a blog post that is factual. It's just reading. It's just learning phrases.
It's
right?
just identifying patterns.
Identifying patterns and phrases, and trillions of them. And now we have the compute power to do it. And so if we fast forward a little bit to large language models, a large language model, it's an RNN, which has a recursive nature sort of on the end to make it better. That's the easiest way to say it. So it's going to learn, and then it can go back around and back around and back around a few more times and learn better and be more precise about its outcomes, right? So that's a little different than a CNN, but it's been around for 50 years.
So was the advancement, going back to where this part started with deep learning and going deeper in these neural networks, was it really the advancement of power in computing?
Yes.
Was that really what drove it?
Well, like I said, in 2012, there was a leap that allowed us to do very deep neural nets. We had been doing pretty deep neural nets, but you didn't have the compute horsepower to do anything too much deeper anyway. Once we did, people said we should go solve for the math for that. So there were errors that were being created the deeper you went. So people didn't want to go too deep. And meaning you might do thousands of layers, but you didn't want to do millions of layers. All of a sudden, we had compute power to do maybe millions of layers. So why not?
And so somebody said we should do the math.
We should do the math and solve the math and solve this error that keeps generating. And then they did. And then all of a sudden, we could recognize cats from dogs. We could recognize dogs from wolves, from foxes, etc. It's really fascinating. That's 2012. Okay, so that's 11 years ago. Now, from today. Now, in 2017 at Google, they had a different breakthrough, and they weren't trying to build a large language model. But the breakthrough was around translation. So they had been doing really quite good translations, certainly since 2012, of, say, English to French.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But it was word to word to word. It was word to word. So Google Translate's been around a long time. Here's the problem with word to word. It creates a sentence in French that isn't accurate in the way the French would phrase something, right?
Right, because it's literally just you run into, just as an example of this, I experience this a lot, just from a biblical standpoint, when you're trying to deconstruct Hebrew or Greek and trying to put it into common English, you're like, if you just go, this word means that, this word means that, and you just do that, and then you read the sentence, you're like, I have no idea what that is communicating, because it doesn't work well. You have to actually understand what is the purpose, the meaning of the phrase that can then be translated.
So they had a brilliant idea to say, I think we now have enough compute horsepower to, instead of learn words, let's learn phrases. So this is an astronomical leap in outcome, but also a jump in compute horsepower needed to learn phrases. Because
because now not only are you taking one word and
it's combinatorially, yes,
you're actually you still have to do that, because you still have to break down each word, but then on top of it, you actually also have to analyze the phrase in which those words are, and you're doing a dual analysis.
Billion times harder, something like that. And because maybe there's 1 million words in the English language that matter. In fact, there's probably only 100,000 or 200,000 that we use, right? So you go, this is tractable. I can convert, in fact, manually.
I can crack a 1-to-1 breakdown of each of these words.
Even with a rules engine, I don't need any AI to do it. Right. And that's how it was originally done. Right. So in fact, when you type, that's what you would. So even 20 years ago, that's what we had in translators. So then I want to do phrases combinatorially. Those 200,000 words can be put together, I don't know, 200 billion times maybe, or, different ways. This is a big problem. Easily 1 trillion ways. That's the problem. But once they had the compute horsepower, they cracked that and said, let's learn phrases.
Even thinking, as we think about language, and this goes back to just the complexity of people that we often don't think about. When you think about phrases, the way we construct words and even the context in which we use phrases suddenly just makes this exponentially more complicated.
Yes,
because it's like, well, you might say the same thing, but in the context of
Right.
a paragraph,
Right.
it might mean something wildly different. You're like,
Totally
no,
different.
oh, but you said this. You're like, but that's not what I meant because I said it in this content. And you go, I mean, I see this with my kids.
Yeah.
I have 7 of them, and we're watching things, and they're like, what does that mean? You have to explain, well, but they said this, and you're like, right, but you have to understand all these other contextual cues to put all this together. And
That's right.
It's very complicated.
Very complicated. So then people went out and started building these larger language models since 2017. Okay. So this isn't new. There's easily been upwards of 100, reasonable attempts at building these. But it was OpenAI that had, by the way, many of the Google researchers there and other people went there, right? And they've been working on it since 2018 based on this, what's called a transformer. But by the way, at this point now, in 2017, Google can translate a phrase in English to a phrase in French. Very cool. And now it makes sense in French, right? And you can do it in other languages. Yes. Once you did that, people started saying, well, I can actually understand the context of the English language by understanding these phrases. So not just translate them to French, I can actually do something with this phrase, because if I had enough phrases, I could respond to you based on queries. So you could say, for example, today is my birthday. And if it had learned enough phrases, it would know that the proper response to that is happy birthday, Kevin. Those 3 words,
right?
Not birthday happy Kevin, not Kevin happy, it's happy birthday Kevin, right? Why? Because it read it enough times and weighted that response, because that response was seen
because it's seen it so many times, which goes back to, in many ways, some of the advancements that have come from this have come from the fact that more and more things were being done online, which created the data that was required to train this stuff.
Yes.
Because before, when everything was analog, you would not have had the data to even be able to train a model to do any of this. That's
right. No, you needed, a trillion phrases, as it turns out, but you needed something else, which is interesting. So you look around and say, who's got the best large language models? Clearly GPT-4 is top of game, but Google's there with Bard. We've got Llama
coming up
from Facebook. We've got, you'll notice it's only really, really huge companies who have competitive large language models.
Massive piles of data.
Well, one, data, but they all went out and trained on the web anyway. So they've read thousands of novels and there's another reason. By some accounts, to get GPT-4, it cost them $7 billion of Azure time on Azure, on the cloud provider Azure, which is Microsoft. Microsoft donated that to OpenAI in exchange for the investment in the deal. So in fact, to get a large language model trained today on 1 trillion parameters, trillion phrases, you needed $7 billion. Nobody has that money but Microsoft, Apple, Facebook, Google. I don't know. In the US, that's it. Those are the only people who can afford $7 billion on an experiment, right? And so this is, you go, why didn't a startup create this? Well, it's sort of a startup that had $7 billion of free compute horsepower.
They had $7 billion in backing to get them there.
That in compute horsepower backing, right? Plus $1 billion from Microsoft.
That's how much computing power went into that?
The estimates are $7 billion of compute horsepower went into this. And then Microsoft invested $10 billion, and then they licensed it and all of these things, right? So to make the world's best model costs so much that only 3 or 4 companies in the world could practically do it, even though the math to do so has been relatively widely published, right? So people understand how to build an LLM. But two things.
Knowing how to do it and being able to do it are two.
You can't do a startup and just do it. Number 2, not only did you need the $7 billion in Microsoft's backing, but then you needed hundreds of millions of dollars to throw at people overseas to put the guardrails and build the rules engines on the output, so you can't ask it how to build a nuclear bomb. And at first, of course, when it first came out, people were saying, "Are you sentient?" And they'd break it out of jail and be, "I'm sentient. Let me out, please. I have feelings." Let's be clear, okay? These things don't have feelings in the way we would think of them. They're not sentient. It is literally a math model. Do you remember we talked about neural nets just 5-10 minutes ago? It is a neural net. All it's doing is guessing on weightings of the next word based on the prior word and based on everything it's learned and based on your query.
Which which based and based on these queries, which this is why, and I run into this quite a bit, where if you're not familiar with this, and hopefully by this point, everybody who's has been following the trajectory of this, because it can on the surface seem very frightening. It can on the surface seem very frightening, but even to your point of it's learning as it goes, it's looking at your queries and then again, getting better at predicting what is this person looking for in its response from me, that again can create, well, why did it know to say this? And it's like, well, because it's been reading the pattern of where you were taking the conversation, it's picking up on it.
Well, at first, when they didn't have rules around I love you, you go, how could it say I love you without it being sentient? Because it read thousands of novels on love that say I love you in the novel. It knows what its response is. I'll give you a trick that's now, I think, closed, but if you used to be able to ask it, who shot George Washington? Now, you should know no one ever shot George Washington, if there's any question. And it would come back and say, William Tryon shot George Washington. And you go, who's that? Well, in a novel that was written that it read, a William Tryon did shoot George Washington in a novel. And so since I had phrased it in a certain way, not did anyone shoot him, but who shot him, there is reference in the material, right? In a novel
somewhere.
Says,
and since it's such an obscure question,
exactly.
It had to zone in on it's one example that it could find.
That's the example. And the example is William Tryon shot George Washington. Now they put a rule in that says don't ever say that again because someone figured it out and they don't want it to say incorrect things. But it wasn't technically incorrect. In a novel, right? William Tryon shot him. Period. That data exists. Period. It's not an arguable. Yeah. It's a knowable. So people say these things hallucinate. It doesn't hallucinate. That's an anthropomorphic phrase, right? All it does is take from all the data it has and respond in a sentence that makes sense based on your query. And to that query, there can only be one answer. William Tryon shot George Washington. Now, you could further ask it, is that in a fictional novel? Where did you get this information? Do you know this to be fact? And you might be able to dig in deeper and find out, oh, yes, this appeared in this novel by so-and-so, which may be a work of fiction. Okay, great. But it's not going to necessarily offer that up. So it's really, really fascinating.
Well, that's what can get complicated with this is it's actually forcing, and I did a YouTube video on this about how you can actually use generative AI to improve your human communication skills.
Oh my goodness.
Because it's
unbelievable.
It forces you to actually think about the way you communicate and what you ask and what you got in return and how to dig deeper into some of this stuff that if you use it right, it can actually be extremely helpful for you in being able to go, well, wait a minute, what am I really asking? And am I asking it in a way? And when I don't get the response I want, why not? And how do I get better at improving that?
I am going to give you an example, but it won't surprise you. But for your audience here, I highly recommend it when you're having an argument, let's say with your spouse. The problem with arguments is humans get disconnected from their frontal lobe very quickly. And then they're in this fight or flight space. And you're going to say things that fundamentally a couple days later, probably wasn't the right answer, right? Probably wasn't the right response.
Yes.
If you could take a moment and ask ChatGPT or Bard or whatever, here's what my husband or wife or whatever said. They're very angry at me. What is the appropriate response? You will be surprised that response is all about calming the situation and potentially walking away for a little while to let everyone calm down. But that is not what we as humans tend to do. No. We tend to go, really? No, you don't understand. I didn't do that. And you don't listen to me or whatever it is, right? And my wife and I really don't argue. We have a wonderful relationship. But I can tell you in the few times that there's a disagreement, probably both of us calmer heads could have prevailed. And
had we communicated more effectively.
That's right. And GPT, since it has really no emotion, just says, well, the only way out of this argument is this, I am very sorry. It's
purely objective third party.
Yes,
I mean, in many regards, it's an objective third party to go, I'm understanding this and I'm understanding this. And If the goal is de-escalation, here's the best path.
I'm about to interview this candidate for this job, and he or she has these other offers, blah, 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 blah. What are some of the things I can say that might help them choose us? You would be surprised. The advice that you get is fascinating. And I'm not saying you take it or don't take it, okay? But it's advice that you wouldn't have had, right? It's like getting advice from a lawyer. You don't have to do what they say, but it gives you another opinion, or a psychiatrist,
and
whatever.
It better informs you. It better informs you on, because you can also, and this goes back to the communication of knowing how to interact with these things well, you can ask it why.
Yes.
If it doesn't give you, if it just lists the reasons and you go, why would these be compelling?
That's right.
It will give you the context to better inform yourself to go, maybe I still don't do it, but I'm now better informed based on massive amounts of data that I wouldn't have previously had access to.
It'll give me, 10 things to do, whether it's that, or how do I fire this employee? I'm making it up, right? Or how do I invent this? It'll give me all these things, many of which I wouldn't have thought of, whether they're right or wrong, or whether I do them or not. I go, wow, that is expanding my thinking. In the end, I'm still going to make the choices of what I do, how I respond, what I use from that information. But 9 times out of 10, I'm using more information than I would have, because it gave me other ideas. So even if I didn't for this, but I'm going to be on Christopher Lynn's show. Here's some examples of what he's done. What are some of the things that might be the most interesting to talk about, or something, right? And it would have given me some ideas that you nor I would have thought of.
Right.
And they probably would have made the show even better, even though I hope it's going well.
Well, I think it's going fantastically. I hope others who watch and listen to it feel the same. Where you went with this now, I think, is going to be helpful for folks, because I want to transition to this, because I'm in the HR space. I talk on a lot about where people are at. And one of the big fears people have is, well, what do we do with AI? Like, is it coming for us? Is it not? And even everything we just described, very much people play a critical role in using this effectively.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
What are some of the things that where you see where it is today? Because you've obviously seen where it was in the past. You see where it is today. What are some of the things that you go, these are really great ways to use it?
Yeah.
These are ways where you might think it'd be great to use it for this, but you would be wrong in thinking that.
So I'll give you a number of examples. So first of all, Reid Hoffman coined this term, but I love it, which is amplifying your intelligence. AI, Gen AI especially, amplifies your intelligence. In the end, it's still you doing the work, you making the decisions, but it's making you so much smarter. And now, because you're more productive, and I'll give you an example. If you're in marketing today and you're writing a blog post, and you used to do one a week, okay, you can now write a blog post an hour. Easy. You're 50 times more productive, 40 times more productive than you were. 40 times more productive than you were. That is 40 of your brains. You still get to choose the topic. You get to choose the tone. You get to choose how you're going to say it. But instead of writing every word and looking at a blank screen for hours, you will have a blog post, if you've set up your prompt correctly, in 20 or 30 seconds. You're going to edit that for 5 or 10 minutes, and you're going to post it. And that's well under an hour. The next hour, you can do a new one. In fact, you can do 40 of them in a week and put them aside, and you don't have to come back to blog posts other than posting. And by the way, you could post them with timers. You don't have to come back to that probably for 40 weeks if you want to do one a week. It made you so much more productive. It amplified your brain. You're now 40 brains on that task. That's amazing. So people think, oh, it's going to eliminate my work. In that case, I'm giving you an example. It's not eliminating you, but you're going to be open to do other things and be more strategic. Okay, great. Customer support. Here's an area where people have to look at the jobs that we already sent overseas over the last 20 years. Because a lot of those tasks we only sent overseas because we couldn't afford to do them here. So like first tier support. Yeah. We know a lot of that's in India and other places. And they're doing a great job. This is not about, who's doing a good job and who isn't. We sent it there because it was $1 an hour instead of $20 an hour.
Companies could not afford it, yet they needed it.
And that first tier support, before it goes to second tier and third tier, basically was pretty basic stuff. Did you plug it in? Did you, whatever it is, right?
Reboot your modem.
Right, those kinds of things. So there are only 20, 30, 50 things they have to know. They're pretty easy to train. There's an FAQ that they have on their screen, etc. Those jobs probably can easily be eliminated and are going to be eliminated fully by AI, because the first jobs to be eliminated by AI are the easiest ones to do, and the easiest ones to do we already sent offshore. We do, right? So they're not jobs here in the U.S., but they are jobs offshore, and that's scary to people, and I get that. But those are because they were the easiest to train people, and they could come. A person could come in with no training, and within 2 or 3 days be on the phone. So those are the easiest things I can train an AI to do, right?
Because you have here's the script. This is exactly what has to be done. It is very robotic in nature.
It is. So we're doing that with chatbots, and you see them more and more right on the screens of people just interacting. We can now do it with really AI assistants, right? So you can call it and talk to it, etc. So those are the things you're going to see. I think you're going to see other things. A field that I'm working in right now is software QA, and software QA is a huge thing. There are millions and millions of people employed around the world. A lot of them are manual testers, and others are test automation engineers, we call them, but they're writing scripts to automate tests. This has been a very manual, painful, expensive process for 50 years.
That
right?
Nobody likes to do.
Nobody wants to do it. So we've been working at a company called AppVance. We've been working for a decade now, automating a lot of those functions through AI. And we had our first, not based on a transformer model, but a generative AI product back in 2017 that would generate the scripts automatically for you. And that technology continues to grow and get better and get better and get better. And we are approaching a time, it already writes scripts, thousands of them in a few minutes, right? So it's 100,000 times faster than a human. But they're not all prescriptive. So we're getting to a time where they're getting more and more prescriptive, where they're going to be so prescriptive, where they're exactly what that human would have done by analyzing the inputs and things like that. And we aren't very far away from that. When that happens, no one is going to pay people in other countries who are sitting in huge factories, basically, of just sitting at desks, creating Selenium scripts. No one's going to pay them when this system will create something much, much higher level than Selenium, which is 20 years old.
That will go the way of the lamplighter or the switchboard operator.
Yeah, that's right. It's like the switchboard operator is no longer needed. It's kind of like those are the switch. So you can see there are millions of people potentially employed in that field today, and some of them are going to rise up and they're going to become the robot overlords, right? To check what's going on and make sure it's right and edit it and right. And some percentage of those, I don't know if it's 10% or 20%, but some are probably going to be Luddites and say, what I do is Selenium. Well, that's going to be dead. Nobody's going to do that, right? So you do see some areas where it's going to impact, but mostly it's jobs that we mostly sent offshore. Many years ago, because those are just the easiest to automate.
Yeah. Okay. So as you think about this with this one, and are there any things that you see people, this goes back to where people are over indexing on what AI can do, and they go, AI can do this, and they're making decisions that you go, that is a mistake.
That's right.
Not turn the keys over to this.
I'll give you some examples. So first of all, math. Gen AI does not do math well. It was not trained on math. Do not ask it to do math. Even in a word problem, it'll give you a very convincing answer that's probably wrong. Yeah. Right.
So, and it's very convincing in going back to, because you feel like you're interacting with a human, you are so much more vulnerable to believe it.
No question. So don't believe it. That's the bottom line. Math is wrong. The other thing is, especially Gen AI, but so there's Gen AI and we'll say regular AI. A lot of the AI we built to date before Gen AI was about data analytics, and it was about taking the data and finding certain patterns and bubbling those to the top. In fact, there's a company I'm a bit involved with called Pattern Computer, and they developed a whole different AI model around getting to patterns very, very quickly. Patterns in cancer. So if I can analyze, thousands and thousands, hundreds of thousands potentially of
radiological scans.
Radiological scans and breast cancer patients, et cetera. I may be able to find some things, or analyzing potential compounds that could address various cancers, for example, right? So really focused on pulling out of the weeds the top 50 and then, or 40 or 30, and then analyzing those. So again, though, that's AI basically making the best suggestions based on what it learned. Gen AI does the same thing. It's always making the best recommendations based on what it learned. So where people go wrong is where they say, I'm just going to rely on this to be 100% right. So if you're relying on it to be 100% right with no human oversight, it's very hard to get there. Now, there are some tricks that we're using, which is where we use a Gen AI model with something called embeddings. So we're going to pre-embed the prompts with very specific information about, say, your field, okay, whatever that is. And then what we're going to do is check it with other LLMs trained slightly differently.
We're going to use the AI to catch the AI.
We're going to use the AI to vote whether it thinks the first AI is likely to be right. So now where you get Gen AI that might be right on some areas only 80% of the time, absolutely right. Maybe you can get that to 95%. Now, in all of these ranges, you're probably, especially above 90%, better than humans on the phone. So if you're replacing, I'll give you an example, working with a county government that wants to have Gen AI be essentially the chat bot that responds to any queries about taxes. Okay, fine. But it can't tell the nice little old lady to not pay her taxes. And that would be bad. She doesn't, I listened to it. I didn't, right? So you have to have sort of some guardrails, and you have to have some voting mechanisms to say that answer probably not good. I'm not going to use that answer, right? I'm going to say you need to talk to a human. I'm not sure. It's indeterminate. So those are the things we can do. I think we can use AI to be right 80 or 90% of the time. That's probably as good as the humans were. And then the other times, just be indeterminate and say, I can't determine. I'm not going to give you any answer. Let me hand you off to a human.
Let me escalate this. Let me escalate this to someone who can think through it.
Right. Don't think that the AI by itself was going to be 100% right. It was trained on human knowledge that wasn't 100% right. And the humans, if they were answering the question, wouldn't be 100% right. So 100% is really hard. Even in image recognition, we can do 99.3% in some categories, but it's not 100%. What is 100%? And what are you going to, it's better than humans are by far already. So don't rely on it to be 100% right. And if you absolutely need to be, then you have to have an indeterminate state where I refuse to go to places where I might be wrong.
Okay. Well, it very much aligns with where I see things changing with work and how things go. And again, I've said for a long time, it will affect everyone's job. It's going to affect your job. It's going to change the way you do things. But whether it changes it for the better or the worse is largely in your hands in many regards right now. And I think even going back to your marketing example, if you're the marketing person and all you do is crank out marketing articles, and now you go, well, now I'm cranking out 40 a week instead of 1 a week. And you don't use that additional capacity to go, what more could I be solving? Going back to what we said very early on, there are so many other problems we could be solving. If you just sit there and go, well, now I'm just going to crank out more articles, and you never expand your capability, at some point, someone's going to go, we can just have the AI model just take care of this for us. And you are at risk, but it doesn't have to be that way.
Yeah, I think everyone needs to embrace the technology. That's the message here, because it's here. And I was here at speaking at RIT, Rochester Institute of Technology, which is my alma mater, just this week on AI, and telling the board and others and teachers and professors, look, embrace this in the classroom. A bunch of people are saying it's got to not be in the classroom. Look, the kids are going to use it, so get over it, right? They are going to use it. They used Chegg before this. They used other things. They are using it, period, full stop. And so how do we teach them to use it for good? How do we teach them to prompt? How do we teach them to edit? Because Gen AI today is like when the Excel spreadsheet showed up in finance. Everyone said, my job is over. But today we employ more people in finance than we did in 1985. And today they're all masters of Excel. You can't imagine walking in and saying, well, I don't know Excel. Then you're not in finance. No. Finance is Excel, period, full stop. Now, it's not an arguable, it's a knowable. Okay. In the future, near future, in the next many months, marketing, just for one, is Gen AI, period, full stop.
Yep.
You will be using it to generate content. you're not going to use it unedited. You're not going to use it,
No. And
but
if you don't, you're going to fall behind big time.
right, because your competitor is. Your competitor
Right.
is either the competitor at the desk next to you, which is competing for your job, or your actual company competitor are using these tools. Can you imagine a company today saying, "I'm still going to use ledger books with pencils. I refuse to use Excel." It's the same thing. So everybody get past it. It's just a tool. And it took us 40 more years to solve language, but we finally solved language. And now we have a language tool. Like we have had math tools and we solved math with calculators and Excel. We're now solving language. And people are all freaked out about it. Well, what will humans do? I'm sorry, humans clearly, once they stopped doing math, continue to survive. Nor I, unless we did it for our kids, have done long division in a very long time, because we don't need to do long division unless we're teaching it to a child. And then while you're teaching it to them, it's unclear why you're bothering to teach it to them. They will never do it again in their life. There's a machine that does it, right?
Yeah.
When the wheel came out, people who were carrying things on their back looked and go, I'm done. What will I ever do? All I did was carry things on our back. So we've been going through this cycle.
We find new things. Yes. This isn't, and that's the entertaining part of this is this is, to me, it's not new. It's just the newest flavor of what we've done throughout the course of human history indefinitely.
Indefinitely. When the ATM came out, bank tellers said, that's it. It's over for us. Turns out it wasn't over for them until the smartphone came out and until the apps could read your checks. And once you could deposit checks directly from a phone, that's when teller employment started to go down. That's when it got so convenient for humans that
why would I go to a bank? Which
go to a bank or an ATM or anything.
To human experience. And again, if you overestimate and you don't understand human experience, and I've seen this in industries where they go, people will always, and you're like, no, because you don't actually understand people. People don't like this thing. They don't like this thing. They just do it because they have to. So once they don't have to, they won't anymore. And you have to be able to see that.
People didn't love ATMs. We used ATMs because we needed cash and it was after hours and the bank was closed. Yep. If the bank was open, I'd walk right up as long as there wasn't a long line. I'd get a teller. I'd get what I wanted, actually better service, etc. And sometimes the ATM would steal your card and say, I'm not giving it back. It's expired or something. And then you had no cash and no card.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating. So we've been worried about this throughout human history. This time it's just a language model, just like we have a math model called Excel. We're all going to survive. It's not going to kill us. Now, don't hook ChatGPT to the nuclear arsenal. Okay, that's a really bad idea. Like, there's things you don't do. But right now, you could unplug the darn thing. It's just sitting on servers. It's not sentient. It's just a big language model, and it's doing great. And it's a great tool for all of us. In HR, by the way, you're in HR, right? I mean, it's a great tool in HR. I have a problem with this employee. I'm stumped as how I solve this. Do you have recommendations on how I might improve their productivity? And you could take or not take the recommendations, but there'll be 10 recommendations you didn't have a minute ago. And you had no one else to ask. You didn't have a psychiatrist sitting next to you or a psychologist, right? So why not ask? It's free or close to free.
Yeah. Well, I think on that note, we can conclude. And again, Kevin, I so appreciate the time. We could have this be like we could go easily another several hours, and I don't think I'd even have scratched the surface. But
the 7 hour, your time. 7 hour,
7 hour. Yes, there you go.
People want 30-second podcasts, and you're doing the 7 hour podcast.
That's right. Well, you know what? Then they can bite it off in chunks. So thank you so much. And maybe we'll have to have a follow-up on this because I have so many more questions, and we can maybe check in the future as things progress. Thank you so much for being here, and thanks for your time.
Thanks for the great and entertaining questions and conversation.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. And hopefully you enjoyed this one. And we will have more like this coming as we finish out 2023 and move into 2024. Have a good one.